Expecting Amanda Grenier. I'm not Amanda Grenier. She is the director for the Centre for Gilbert Centre for Studies on Aging, and she's currently on sabbatical. So I've been standing in for a year, and my term as interim director will be coming to an end in July, and Amanda will be back at the helm. Now, in Amanda's absence, you can see that we have a full crowd tonight, and I'd like to thank Rebecca Hessels, who's just around the corner outside. She's done a lot of hard work to make this happen, and many thanks to her.
Thank you.
Now, before I introduce our speaker today, I know that Beatrice Camp would like to first say a few words about the lecture. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks to all at the Gilbert Centre for organizing today's lecture, and special thanks to Dr. Ellen Ryan for her willingness to deliver the lecture. As many of you know, Karl passed last May, and I'd like to thank everyone who contributed to the I-Fund that McMaster established to support the continuation of the public lecture in Karl's memory. I think Karl would be surprised that so many people remember him. Also pleased. Karl introduced the study of gerontology to McMaster in 1976. In a note to his students during this period, he wrote, "Older persons are too often forced to accept compromising situations and unsatisfactory opportunities for self-fulfillment and experience. Society's attitudes and practices can be negating and degrading for many older people. Do we have to go along with this, or shall we demand that we be respected for what we are, whatever our age? I visualize a world as being different 40 years from now. If we fight for something now, we might in our own small or even large way influence thinking in such a way that the older person will have a chance for a decent living. We will be empowered to make the choices that are right for us when it comes to our care, our independence, and how we access services. We will be encouraged to do what we enjoy and get the support needed to live at home longer or in settings of our choosing. Perhaps then our older years will be fulfilling and satisfying, living in cooperation and intimacy with our fellow beings. I hope as a society we are moving closer to Karl's vision. I think we are. I know he'd applaud anything we can do to make life more fulfilling and satisfying for ourselves and others, regardless of age. Thank you.
So I'd like to introduce our speaker, Ellen Ryan. Ellen is our scholar in residence, actually our senior scholar in residence at the Gilbert Centre for Studies on Aging. She is also a Professor Emeritus at the Department of Psychiatry at McMaster University, and also the Department of Health, Aging and Society at McMaster University of the Social Sciences. Ellen has been involved with gerontology at McMaster, particularly our undergraduate program, for many years, working with Karl and other leaders. She's taught courses for us, she's advised students, and she's supervised thesis projects, and she still does, even though she's supposed to be retired. Every single year, we can rely on Ellen. Her interests, her academic interests are broad. She's a psychologist by training, and they include empirically communication, personhood, and resilience in people with cognitive impairments and older age groups more generally. More recently, Ellen's been a leader in arts-based approaches in social gerontology, in particular using poetry and writing in later life. For emotional well-being. This is very cutting edge at the moment in social gerontology, and as I said, Ellen is at the forefront of this. She's here to speak to us today about journal writing in particular, and its impacts upon emotional wellness and self-identity in older age. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for beginning today with Karl's statement, which I don't remember ever seeing, from 1976. I came in the mid-1980s to McMaster when it was clearly time to begin a gerontology program after Karl's efforts and Ron Bain's. But that statement of what our vision for older age would be and life for all generations I could sign my name just today. This should be our vision, and certainly learning how to live and age well within community is such an important emphasis. I really did enjoy working with Karl in the gerontology program, and I'm going to start my talk by talking about his writing through health adversity. My focus today, as you can see, is finding a new voice, and you'll see what I mean, both an inner voice, a sense of who we are through writing, and also finding an articulate voice with which we can influence society, finding our social voice. And I'll be talking about published literature and making comments probably about students of writing who haven't yet published but may. This is the cover of Karl's biography, athlete, scholar, and gentleman. I met him when he was 60-ish. And he was already a national champion in skiing, and on his retirement he became a European champion in skiing as well, a real model of what you can do health-wise in the later years. And by the way, it was an intergenerational effort. I think by the time he and I were working together the second Christmas, I'd been to Canadian Tire and bought 5 sets of cross-country skis for our family, and we got really good instruction from Karl on the Ancaster Golf Course. An interesting story about Karl's biography is he wasn't able to write it himself. Beatrice was the editor-in-chief of collecting, helping him to record his story, and his story involved her having many discussions, eventually hiring somebody who could help to put together a book of life memories. At one point, one of my students, Karen Letavera, was involved, and it was very exciting for Karen to be involved. She was a 25-year-old second degree in gerontology student who had a degree in drama from Queens and was very interested in the arts. And she had a Finnish name, Letavara, and her grandfather had come from Finland to Thunder Bay, and she really had never known him and didn't know anything about her Finnish identity. So it was really exciting for Karen to be talking with Karl to learn through him about her Finnish identity, about Karl's Finnish identity, and then through him about her own identity. And I think that's an example of what can happen when some younger people help older people to write and record their memories, their life stories. It can often be mutually enriching. So it starts out as helping a person to record their stories, but becomes something much more in terms of passing on the values from generation to generation. In Karl's book, there's many statements about his values and his memories of childhood, growing up first as a farmer and then as a refugee from war, and taking a long time to become the professor that he was when he retired from McMaster University. It wasn't a straight road, it was a meandering and I think very fulfilling road. And one of his statements about how he would like to be remembered from the book is, "I would like to be remembered for becoming who I am and achieving what I have, despite being a farmer's son from a small farm in eastern Finland and going through the war experience." And that's an example of what one can do when you record memories of having gone through tough times. You get to actually think about, well, how you would be remembered and have a way of conveying that story. Many of us in our older age are surprised at what our kids don't know about us and certainly what our grandkids don't know. I wrote a card. We have an intergenerational card making project in one of my writing groups, and I wrote a Halloween card for my 5-year-old granddaughter. And first in it I wrote about when I was 5, what Halloween was like, and that didn't go very far. So then I drafted, well, when my brother was 5, it was really exciting because he won the Best Costume Award, and the gift and the prize was a German Shepherd puppy. Can you believe it? And not to mention my granddaughter, but my children are saying, "What do you mean you had a puppy? You never told us you had a puppy. What kind of puppy?" Blah, 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 blah. So one of the things I learned about that is when you're telling a story, don't tell it all. But also, even things like the fact when I applied to university, I chose universities to emphasize my desire to work in mathematics. I was in the States, and I had to choose places where girls were allowed to attend. And my daughter did not know that there was a restriction of that sort in my day. In any case, there are all kinds of stories that we have to tell, and one of the developmental aspects of life is we were not listening after dinner at Thanksgiving or holiday feasts when all the old people sat around and told stories. We went off running with our friends, our cousins or whatever, and it's only when we get into our 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s that we're saying, well, if I'd only sat there, then I'd know why Grandma did this and where Grandpa came from, and I'd know, right? And when we're when we're growing up, we hear things about our parents. They're trying to tell us things, but we're not listening. But there's a later time when a lot of us in our writing groups are saying, I wish I listened, I wish I asked when I had the chance. So there's the general issue about writing memoir, but today I want to focus specifically on writing memoir about illness difficulties, newly acquired disability, going through chronic illness, going through difficulties, and what that can do for us. Oh, here's another of Karl's quotations about the value of examining our experiences. Out of examination of these experiences of insight, occasional insight, we gain clearer understanding of our nature and the essence of our being. These are the points of awakening to the possibility of being ourselves, our own consciousness. So one of the opportunities in older life, after we've had many life experiences, is to come to see gain a sense of ourselves, of our true selves, of our whole selves, and seeing all the parts of our lives put together. That's particularly in danger if we are going through illness experiences or disability experiences. We often feel our identity fractured by that. And writing about those experiences for ourselves and for others can bring ourselves back together again. I began writing about illness experiences largely because of my contact with Jim Braddock, who had ALS, a gorgeous golden California professor, brought down by ALS. I spent some time on sabbatical at the University of California, Santa Barbara, when he was already in a wheelchair on a respirator. He could still speak at that time. He had a beautiful, beautiful voice, but he could only speak. He couldn't move. He could move his neck a tiny bit. He could move his eyes, fortunately, to govern computer technology, but he couldn't move his hands and feet, and had difficulty breathing even with the respirator. And he was moved to start, he was an academic, but he was moved to start writing poetry to express his emotions about going through this experience. And this is a beautiful little bit of excerpt of one of his poems. Memory of light, bore the moment to the core, drain duration from the day. Once this I could have done when I saw the morning sun refracting upon apricots in a crystal bowl. This is a picture of him using computer technology with eye motion with a camera on his eyeglasses. And dictation software, this was in the late 1990s. And he was in on the beginning of dictation software, and my goodness, it was challenging and difficult to get the computer to understand what he meant to say. To communicate. My life is certainly unusual now. No real speech, no breathing, no eating, and no running toward the sky, orange trees, dogs, and kids. But I can still think, for good or for ill, and I can communicate the results of this thinking thanks to some astounding computer magic. And nowadays we're all familiar with this magic because of Stephen Hawking, another of our ALS heroes who recently passed away. So through the technology, the respirator is keeping him alive, and the eye motion technology is allowing him to continue. He wrote several books using this technology. He would attend faculty meetings, and he wouldn't say anything because it's a long, tedious process. But everybody would make tentative conclusions, and then they would wait for the email that might come 4 hours later, because that's where the wisdom would be. And you're kind of pressed to be wise when it's so hard to get every word put together. And he rose to that calling. Naomi Wingfield is one of my heroes. Some of you may have known her. She passed away a couple years ago in her 102nd year, lived in Westdale for 35 years. In her 80s, she began writing poetry. And her poetry is being read all over the city by older people because it's simple and poignant and talks about difficult circumstances. She was in our writing group and had to give up her license because of visual difficulties, and was moving into assisted care and having a great deal of difficulty. She was not a complaining person, but several times she really was having a hard time. And then she came, and she had turned the complaints into poems. And we and continued after she stayed in our writing group several years. She would be picked up and come to the writing group one time, and every other time we would meet at her retirement home. It's a good way to move into a retirement home, saying, well, we've got my writing group will be here twice a month. And so she wrote this, "In My New Home." By the way, this is her photograph at the age of 95. So one of the things she also taught me is that you can look good at any age. She and her sister, Norma Bidwell, you may know her from The Spectator. Norma and Naomi died in the same year. Norma just turning 100, and Naomi almost 102. And they, in their 90s, thought, well, there's only frumpy clothes available for old people. And so they went to a dressmaker and got the dressmaker to design fashionable clothing for them. So, and they always got their hair done and dealt with makeup, and they were just old ladies looking good. I want someone to know me, not this quiet woman in the huge dining room, hearing nothing, seeing shapes, not faces. I want someone to know how Hafiz lifts my spirit, brings a friendly God closer, how babies make my heart race, how an earthquake-sized gap swallowed my husband and friends. I want someone to know my fear of future darkness and my joy each morning. I want someone to know me. And isn't that going to be our prayer if we ever have to go into long-term care? And I am working with aging community groups, and we're trying to find alternatives, home sharing and mutual support, in ways that we can stay more supported in our interdependence for longer. Father Killian McDonald is a well-known founder of the Ecumenical Institute in Minnesota. He's a monk and also a poet, and he wrote this about losing his hearing. My first hearing aid. Must you mumble, garble, consonants, rush to the end, drop last syllables? Must I teach phonetics again? Speak with precision. Like Professor Henry Higgins, I'm a reasonable sort of man, bearing malice toward none. If only diphthongs were purer, vowels and lives did not decay. So the writing allows people to express the emotion of dealing with difficulties, and while they're doing that, come to terms with the new state of their body and senses, and in some cases cognition. So in the writing, we can find our inner voice, recapture our sense of identity, as Karl was saying. We can find meaning in our experiences. We can convert emotion and images to words and story. If it stays as huge, big, dark cloud of emotions, it can be overwhelming. But if we write about it enough, we get it tempered down into words and stories, that we can get it down to, so small into stories that we can even forget it then. It's not a big glob of something caught in our throat or caught in our chest or caught somewhere in our body where we can't seem to deal with it. There's also the story script in our culture, and universal in our culture. When you tell a story, then you have a setting, you have a main character, which in this case is me, and then something difficult happens, and the story schema we have is the protagonist rises and deals with the difficulty and comes out on the other side better. And if you write, even for yourself, just writing across the page, that story schema locks in and leads you to some way of getting to the other side. So this has happened to me, and I can't do this, and I can't do that, and I've had to give up this, and who knows what's happening next. And why me, why me? You eventually get to, well, why not me? And, well, look what I'm surviving. Look what I'm learning. Look how I'm learning how to cope with this, that kind of thing. And you find yourself writing to a place of greater peace. You see yourself in wider context, why not me? You can write out how to cope with problems of daily life. Well, I had some experiences with double vision and some years when I had great difficulty reading, and I really missed the reading, and I could write with large print, and I could figure out how I was going to manage my day without reading by sitting and writing. So you can cope with problems. You can cope with interpersonal problems. If you've got family issues or whatever, you can write out, you know, this is me and my daughter, or me and my brother-in-law, and why do every time we see each other at a holiday thing, why do we get in an argument? You can write it, you know, why is he always like that, blah, blah, blah. And then you can say, well, now let me take his point of view. And then you find yourself writing, why is she like that all the time? And you realize that the she is you, and it opens your mind. So you can do some actual problem solving by writing in a journal or on a piece of paper with your cup of coffee or your chosen drink. You discover the lessons learned, you can express creativity. You can find, as Jim Braddock found, real joy in finding a way of writing poems or writing a letter to somebody, or just being very pleased with, or doing drawing or music. The writing can lead to other kinds of art. So having a chance to express creativity when you're in a situation perhaps of not being able to do your usual activities. And you can find the humor. As you know, everybody says that living a good life requires a good sense of humor. The longest living people are the people with the best senses of humor. If not originally, then in the end. Naomi also can write about pain, and Joshi's here, and we heard Naomi read this in a room filled with caregivers being honored for their work, and hundreds, I think, and you couldn't hear a pin drop when she was reading this poem. Bring back the pain. My dear one, when you died, the pain was a jackhammer destroying me. In time, it became a small hammer, the size to hang a picture. Pain and memories were the Cheshire Cat. Stop fading. I want to remember the sparkle in your eye, your foot touching mine, the feel of your back as I curl around it, the autumn smell of your old tweed jacket. If memories are fading blooms, I welcome pain to keep them fresh. I smile and you are close again, my dear, dear one. So no doubt the paper she was writing on got wet as she was working through this, but in the end she had a poem which was bigger than her grief, a way of having something positive come out of her very difficult experiences. She lived to outlive 2 husbands of 35 years. Viola Jaffe is the mother of Ellen Jaffe, the well-known poet who's been in Hamilton a number of years now. Some of you may be familiar with her poetry. When Ellen's mother was dying, Ellen found out that her mother was writing poetry, and near the end needed some help with the recording of it, etc. And Ellen now has a collection of her mother's poems, and this one I find very appealing, and you'll see why. She or I, she pushes her shopping cart, all she possesses, precious old shoes, a sweater, a blanket, half an old sandwich. No soap, no toothpaste, no makeup, all things I need. But she's not me. I'm not her, except in my recurring dream. She could be me. I could be her. Why not? What would I need from the cart? Toothpaste, soap, friends, relatives, a life. With Karen Bannister, that same student, Karen Letavera, by the time we did this book, she was married. We did a book, Ability Speaks, talking with someone with disability, and we called it Ability Speaks because we used as our sources memoirs of people who had acquired disabilities, losing their vision, losing mobility, losing hearing, losing their minds through mental illness and dementia. And we used the quotations from their work to present our model of how one should talk with a person with disability, and we used what people with disabilities had said in their memoirs about how we should be speaking with them. One of the books is, I had brain surgery, what's your excuse? And this is an author, Susie Becker, who was able to recover quite a lot of her abilities, but she said that the book was her recovery, that the focus on writing a book, and as soon as she could hold a pen, as soon as she could scribble something, originally the scribbles after the brain surgery weren't recognizable, but the whole goal of that she was going to be an anthropologist telling what this experience was like was what she held on to through her recovery. Many of you will know Oliver Sacks, the anthropologist of the mind, such a marvelous neurologist, and his specialty was looking at people who had brain anomalies, either acquired through accidents or strokes or born like Tourette's syndrome, and he would go and live with them day after day and interview them over a long period of time to get to know how they lived with these losses. And what he emphasized, as many of you will know, is how wonderful the strength of these people and how they often had abilities that were striking abilities, even though they had striking disabilities, and how they coped with dealing with visual difficulties, hearing difficulties, walking difficulties, and thinking difficulties. He himself had visual difficulties. He could not recognize faces. As I'm aging, my ability to recognize faces is very deficient. So if I don't recognize you, it's not intentional, it's just part of how my brain works. But Oliver Sacks, all of his life, could not recognize faces. He could be talking to somebody at his office on the second floor, and if that person was still around when he left the building and he said, "Hi, Dr. Sacks," Dr. Sacks had no idea he had just been talking to that person. So he had other strange visual anomalies, and they probably contributed to his interest in other people's anomalies. And also, he was making the best of his, and he was looking for people who were making the best of theirs. Well, the great neurologist actually didn't like to talk to people very much, so his work was talking with people, so his vacation was mountain climbing all by himself. And one time when he was in Europe climbing, he broke his leg halfway up one of these Swiss mountains, and he slid down a while, and then he was hanging on to some tree for the longest time, and knowing as a physician that he would die that night because of hyperthermia, and it's getting to be 5 o'clock, it's getting to be dark, and he's thinking, wow, this is the end. And then there happened to be some foresters coming up to get some wood, and he called and he was saved. And then he went to the hospital and had surgery to fix his leg, and he thought he was done. But when he woke up, and for several weeks he's saying, you know, could you please get this dining room table leg out of the bed with me? I want this piece of wood gone, get rid of it. And it was his physical leg, but he didn't have any identification with that body part. So there were nerves severed in the accident and in the surgery, and as it turns out, he discovered a syndrome. There must have been many other people suffering in the past from this problem, but you only get taken seriously if you're a doctor, and he was not taken seriously for a long time. But after a period of a month or two, he started to get sensation that this leg was there, and he eventually was completely reconnected in his head with his leg. But he wrote the book, A Leg to Stand On, about that experience. And also for him, like Susie Becker, writing the book, or writing a journal about this experience, because no one would listen to him. They just said, it's just not, you just got to, you got to get rid of that idea. It's just that no one would recognize it as a legitimate a problem. But for him, it was very serious, and now, as I said, it's recognized as a syndrome. Writing with a social voice, some of us who write on our own about illness do it for our own individual benefit, or even just to be able to explain to our doctor or to our social worker or to our family what this experience is like, and even to discover what would be the best way to treat me while I'm dealing with this. Some of us are moved to develop a social voice and realize that it's one of the ways of taking something positive out of a negative experience to share our writing about an illness experience. As some of the people I've mentioned already. And well, what would be some of the functions of that? That can put a face on disability. So it's one thing to hear about all the chronic illnesses that older people can acquire, and all the losses that can occur with brain tumors, for example, or strokes, how limbs don't work, and how vision can deteriorate in a number of different ways. It's one thing to learn the statistics and learn what the treatments are, but it's hard to know how a person lives with these lacks, and we can learn that, and the health community can learn it very well from patients who are articulate and able to explain what it's like to live with a vision disability or a hearing disability, or to have a cognitive impairment. You create empathy, one story at a time. It's like when you read in the newspaper that 400 people or 4,000 or 40,000 people died in a particular incident. It hits you, but often what hits you more is reading one story about that little boy, the refugee whose body came up, the 4-year-old whose body came up on the shore, and the picture is around the world, and people are imagining that 4-year-old and the family of that 4-year-old. Somehow it's easier to empathize with one person at a time, and then get a sense of how we would relate to people one person at a time. And so memoirs of going through health adversity can do that kind of thing. We can recover a sense of belonging. So when you experience a health problem, you're disconnected from your usual social connections and your roles. You give up various roles, and when you write as a person who's dealing with Alzheimer's disease, or write as a person who's become blind, or write as a person who's deaf, you start to create a sense of belonging with all the other people who have the same or similar experience, or even a wounded experience. So you have a sense of empathy who've had other kinds of difficulties. You connecting with that new in-group, and you help others with the same disability. So many of these memoirs are driven by, if I only knew at the beginning what I was going to go through, it would have been so helpful. And so they're trying to tell people, you new people who are dealing with this, let me tell you my experience so you have a little bit of map of what might be happening for you. And you can share an emerging identity through writing. And most important, you can educate families and health professionals and social professionals who relate to people with various kinds of disabilities with the authority of being on the inside. So I, as a researcher on dementia, can talk about memory problems and how that might make a person feel. But a person with dementia, when they say, I felt like this yesterday, they have an authority that nobody on the outside can have. And you can also advocate for social change. So many times it's the family members and health professionals who are advocating for change. We need more education, we need more professionals, we need more equipment, we need better housing, we need more accessible communities. But if the person with the disability is out there saying, I need, me and my friends, we need this and that, then it has much more authority. And basically that a person having gone through some kind of health adversity can make a difference and bring good out of their experience. So I'll give you some examples. Bonnie Scher Klein, the mother of Naomi Klein, of wonderful contributions to our society. And Bonnie Scher Klein herself was a videographer before she experienced 2 strokes when she was in her early 40s. My children are in their early 40s. And that completely changed her life. And she wrote a book, eventually, Slow Dance, a story of stroke, love, and disability. One of the things she basically had to do was move from Montreal to Vancouver. Our Canadian climate is not that friendly to a wheelchair, and she had the ability. And even though her husband was a physician, a family doctor with hospital privileges, there were many, many examples in this book of everything being misunderstood and her not being treated as a person. Even though she was in one of the best hospitals in Canada with a physician advocate, it's still tough. It's still tough, and it's good to learn some lessons from Bonnie about those things. And here I'm drawing specifically, after a stroke, there's an opportunity for recovery and a lot of work for recovery, especially a young person who's in her 40s, to work toward becoming normal. Getting back to normal is the goal. And she had to struggle with realizing that normal wasn't going to happen for her. And getting her family and society and the doctors and the rehab staff to understand that normal wasn't going to happen for her, and that a good life would still be possible. So she understood that a good life would be possible before anybody around her did. And I think learning that from somebody who's really articulate. She did this book almost as a videographer, it's all in writing, but what she did was she had her journal. As soon as she could write, she was writing things, and after a while it became intelligible and usable. But then after she was feeling better, she interviewed the players, her husband and her children, her doctor and social worker and people around and who were involved, to talk about try to remember what they were thinking on the day that the first stroke was happening, the day in the hospital when the second stroke was happening, day she first came home, and these various incidents. And so the book has all these other points of view built in. And it does very much seem that she was the first one to have a good idea of what her good life would be without being back to normal. Oh, she, by the way, started a radio show in Vancouver. Oh, I can't remember the name of her. She named her wheelchair, and let's say she named it Gracie. Right now, I'm having a moment of not remembering. She named it, anyway, it's something like My Day with Gracie. So the show was My Life with the Wheelchair. William Styron, you'll know from Sophie's Choice and other very important novels, was a man who went through depressions, and this book, Darkness Visible, is about his experiences, very bleak experiences, going through serious depressions, attempting suicide, and talking in all the articulateness of a famous author. He had all the words to describe this terrible experience. And what he says is, the word depression is not a good enough word. We need a special word, a word like brainstorm, but it's already been taken for something else. To talk about the experience. So of course, if you have famous authors, they're going to probably be better with words, but very often people have, some of these illness memoirs are people's first attempts to do this kind of writing, and can be very, very eloquent. And certainly when I work with people in writing groups, some of the first attempts of people to write the hard things of their lives are really very, very beautiful and communicate right from the heart in a way that people receive from the heart. Gerda Saunders was an anthropology professor in South Africa and also in the United States who experienced early onset dementia. This book is, I think, published in 2016, a recent book. And the book is Memory's Last Breath. Originally, she wrote an essay, telling who I am before I forget my dementia. And she basically created field notes, like anthropologists do, of her experiences with forgetting. And this is her dedication of who the book is for. My book is for you, whether you or someone you love has dementia, or you're a medical professional, or a person searching for your own self after a huge life change, or someone just plain curious, who, like me, feels that the more you know, the better you're able to love. She wrote this essay, and it became for a magazine, a Georgia Review, I think, and then it was taken up by many of the news outlets around the world as such a poignant description of the experience from inside dementia. And then she's written the book. And Richard Taylor's a psychologist. He was unusual because he wrote this book from the inside out, and even 16 years after diagnosis, he was still running a blog about the experience of Alzheimer's. So it really surprised me when I first learned that people after Alzheimer's diagnosis could write a book. And it really surprised the medical profession, all of the medical profession, that people after an Alzheimer's diagnosis could write a book. Many people have written books after an Alzheimer's diagnosis, or have written the equivalent of books. The short story about Alzheimer's is what they told us psychologists in the 80s, is Alzheimer's means that you're not only forgetful, a lot of us are forgetful, but you aren't aware that you're forgetful, and you can't learn new things. And the most surprising thing to me was first seeing the speakers on video, the first people who spoke in front of Alzheimer's societies saying, "I have Alzheimer's, and I am here to tell you what it is like." That just blew my mind. It's one of the biggest intellectual surprises of my adult life, because for 20 years I thought that by definition, you wouldn't be able to do that. And it's people with Alzheimer's who have been telling us that and writing it. And they're much more able to write it than say it, because public speaking isn't for everybody. And ordinary conversation can be especially difficult for people with Alzheimer's, because you say your part, and then somebody says something surprising, and you've got to connect your part to that part, and that's particularly difficult. It's particularly difficult for the Alzheimer's patient when they're visiting their doctor and getting asked all these questions, and so it goes down on their record that they can't talk, that they can't talk coherently, that they can't remember what happened yesterday. But then you read in some of these books, Corey Henderson didn't write his story out. What he did is recorded with a tape recorder, and in one of and then his daughter edited the excerpts, taking out the duplications. And in one of them, he says, "Yesterday, when I was frozen on the stairs, and you couldn't get me to go up or down, I was frozen there. This is what was going on. This man had visual difficulties. The name of his book is Partial View, so part of his Alzheimer's was visual problems. I couldn't see the stairs. I couldn't tell if they were going up or they were going down, so I didn't move. At the same time, I couldn't talk. My language left, so I couldn't tell you what the problem was. But today, a day later, in the quiet, all by myself, I'm making this recording and telling you what was happening." It just blew our minds to find that out. And Richard Taylor was part of writing a blog and telling the world, there are lots of people like me. I'm a psychologist, and I know about these things, but there are a lot of people like me who are going through these experiences and can tell about it. And he wrote to clarify for himself what was going on. So it was a way of journaling, trying to work out what was going on with his mind as he was experiencing Alzheimer's. And as I said, he blogged for 16 years, and he stopped blogging because he was a year and a half into cancer and just lost the energy to do it. It wasn't Alzheimer's that brought him down, it was cancer. And he was always arguing, you've got to listen to those of us who have the illness, and you've got to develop more and more programs for those of us who are experiencing memory loss. At the same time, you should be looking for cures, but don't believe all those news releases that we get every month that the cure has been found. Let's work on living well with the disease. And he, like other people, would emphasize how people decline with an Alzheimer's diagnosis or other kind of dementia because of lack of use, of lack of effort. Everybody thinks, well, the first time you can't read the newspaper, that's because of Alzheimer's, so we won't bother with you with the newspaper anymore. Well, the first time it's because of vision. And all you have to do is make it available on the computer in larger print, and a person with cognitive impairment can still read. Or if you can't do that, you have them read the headlines and say, well, I'll read the articles that you like, you just pick out the headlines. Or I'll print out the articles from the web for the headlines that you're interested in. Or we'll get a high-intensity light. Some of us are reading in the dark. So if you have a problem-solving orientation, then life can be much more active and more engaging. Writing provides empowerment and new roles. So writers become famous, even though they're experiencing health decline, and really get the reward of helping people. Diana Friel McGowan was one of the first people with Alzheimer's writing this book, Living in the Labyrinth, and many of the other authors I've found thank her in their first few pages, saying, I never thought that I'd be able to write a book, but when I read hers, I thought, well, maybe I could, because she was saying you could do it too. This book is a plain language, as it happened chronicle, which I pray will assist others like me who are dealing with this perplexing problem in their families. So it gives you a purpose, writing this book, and at the same time sorting out the what the symptoms are and how to describe them becomes an exercise in creativity. And one of the interesting characteristics of Alzheimer's disease is the language is more metaphorical. So it's easier for people with Alzheimer's to fall into poetry than it is for the rest of us who are focused on logic. And one of the ways of understanding people with Alzheimer's disease is often to think metaphorically. So creative writing is something that may be even more available to somebody with Alzheimer's. Handwriting often deteriorates, but now we have easy access to computer keyboards, which seem to be more appropriate. Christine Bryden was a high civil servant in the country of Australia when she had to retire because of early onset dementia. And she would give talks at these conferences. She was one of the early people with early stage dementia who would give talks at the Alzheimer's conferences. And she found she spoke so well, people didn't believe that she really had a diagnosis of dementia. So she started to show a scan, an MRI scan, during her talk, and asked people, what do you think a person with that scan would be able to do? And the pathologists or neurologists in the audience would say, well, she'd be in a nursing home. This person would be in a nursing home and wouldn't be able to do very much, wouldn't be able to walk or talk or whatever. And then she'd say, that's mine, and move on with her talk. And what she was conveying is that there's so much mysterious about illnesses leading to dementia that the scans don't tell the whole story, and neither do the plaques and tangles tell the whole story. So it's such a mystery. So there's possibility, these books, I think, offer optimism in that the course of the illness might not be as anticipated. Her first book, this is the second, Dancing with Dementia. It's hard to imagine such a title, right? Her first book was written 7 years earlier, and it was called Who Will I Be When I Die? And I thought, that's the book that I would have written 30, 40 years ago, knowing what I did then about the illness. And yet there she is 7 years later, dancing with dementia. It's still very tough, but it didn't decline as precipitously as it has in many other people, for who knows what reason. But she thought, it must be so I can write a second book. But it also could be because she had written the first book. It's hard to know. And this is Corey Henderson, the one who made the recordings. And one of the things that you can do by writing with health adversity is advocate. And here he's advocating for people with Alzheimer's. I'd love to see some people with Alzheimer's not trying to stay in the shadows all the time, but to say, damn it, we're people too. And we want to be talked to and respected as if we were honest to God, real people. So that's my best quote for communication issues, right? Because he's got the authority to say, the rest of us have got to pick up our socks and learn how to communicate respectfully and expectantly with people with dementia. Not easy, but it can be done. And if we're optimistic and positive, it's much more likely. And then I just wanted to mention conversational remembering boxes. We've worked with people who are still at home, and we've worked with people in assisted care to develop conversational remembering boxes. Boxes that have photographs and images and audio tapes or digital tapes of things that will remind people of their favorite stories. So if you're giving away, as a person's moving into a nursing home, you're giving away the grand piano to your granddaughter, you can take a photograph. You can't take the grand piano into your box. You take a photograph of your granddaughter playing on the grand piano, you put that in the conversational remembering box, and then we help people, we elicit the stories about the granddaughter and about the grandfather and all the history of playing the piano in that family, and record in the individual's words on the back of that photograph or in a notebook inside the box, so that these can be triggers for telling stories when the person has more difficulty later on as the disease progresses. And this could be useful for somebody with a hearing impairment. People come to the house and just, once there are a lot of people, you can't hear and you want to have a good conversation, but you end up not knowing how to do it. Having a conversational remembering box with pictures that you want to talk about, and even with some of the stories written out, can facilitate getting conversations going. And what we do know with hearing impairment and other kinds of impairments, cognitive impairment, once you get a good, meaningful conversation going, the brain is operating at top speed and you can move on to other topics. I've got some of my books out back in case some of you would like to buy a copy. We've got 10 books highlighting the writing of older adults. This one, You Grow Out of Winter, and Haven't We? It addresses poetry in long-term care. So our team went into the nursing home and facilitated group poetry and individual poetry with people with varying degrees of cognitive impairment. You can put together a beautiful poem on the color red with all different memories of the color red. And you can put different people's responses together in a poem. It doesn't have to fit like a story. One of them is on whooping cough. Apparently in Hamilton, whooping cough was really a boon for the kids because they had to be taken out for fresh air. They had to be taken from the center of the city by bus out into, I guess, Dundas and Ancaster and Flamborough, or over to the lake to get fresh air. So there are a number of older people in our community who have lots of good things to say about whooping cough scares. In any case, a book like that just gives you ideas, and it's being used to facilitate discussion groups with people in writing groups or in reading groups in assisted care. And here's an example on Seeing Red. And this is just an excerpt. Red roses remind me of someone I love. My husband always gave me red roses at Christmas. I think we did everything together. Always had flowers in the house. I like every red I see. This was put in large print in the room of all the participants for this group poem. And there's a gentleman who had forgotten that he'd given red roses because, once the kids come, you don't do it all the time anymore. And his wife had not been able to talk to him for 2 years. She had apparently lost language. In the group session, she came out with this about, my husband always gave me red roses at Christmas. It does that too, right? And so he knows his wife is still there, even though in ordinary conversation she can't. But there's something about going back to old memories and having them triggered in a situation. And this is a situation where you get to touch the red roses and smell the red roses, a lot of different senses, maybe some songs about roses and flowers, etc., to try to bring back those memories. By very skilled facilitator Chris Higgins. But once that comes, then other language can come too, and other memories. And I just wanted to end with this photograph. One of the things I'm doing these days is taking photographs, and I really love my seagull longing for who knows what. And Pat Schneider talks about writing. She wrote a book, Writing Alone and with Other People, that's available in the library, that very articulately talks about the benefits of writing and also the benefits of writing with other people. By writing, we can howl, sing, or plainly and humbly tell what is true. Our howl of outrage can waken the world to injustice. Our singing writing can waken the world to beauty and to joy. Thank you.
Wonderful talk, very insightful exploration of the literature and writing of both famous and not so famous people. We do have some time for questions, so I'll let you take them.
Okay.
And feel free to ask another question. Don't be shy.
done.
So I just wanted to make a comment that I was in one of Ellen's writing groups, not one for people with
You
disabilities.
can come up front.
Until somebody else has something else to say, I wanted to say that I participated in
Speak
one.
quite loudly, please. There's a fan just come
Okay,
on.
yes, should have me. Sorry, Ellen. That's great. Feels better over here.
I wanted to let you know that I've been in one of Ellen's writing groups, a personal one, and I probably was the youngest person. I still considered an older adult, and with people probably 90, one of the women in the group. And it's not only for, you gave such an inspirational talk on people experiencing a disability, but Ellen's reach is much even greater than that. And I certainly benefited from being in the group and the opportunities to write on a topic and then share within the group, and it's just been wonderful. So Ellen's really an inspiration just across the board, and I've just loved it when I was part of it.
Just to ask, when you talk about these kind of groups, can you tell me where they I haven't heard of it. So what you're saying about Alzheimer's makes a lot of sense to me, but I generally find that people go into a terrible depression and the whole family is on a dive down as soon as they hear that diagnosis. That's been 5 years before it's really, I mean, people sometimes die a little bit. I really find, well, so I'm just interested to hear, these are different, and they would, what you're talking about is more of what I actually would think, but I don't find that is out there. Does that make sense? So I'm just
Yeah.
wondering.
Going down in depression with the diagnosis or acquiring a disability is a universal process, right? So there's no preventing that, but there's coming out of that, right? Then there's what happens next. And I think that reading these, for example, the diagnosis of dementia, I think reading these memoirs, and I have a collection of them in the books that are for sale out there. The green book is Writing to Reclaim Identity with Dementia, and it's mostly based on quotes from memoirs by people who have Alzheimer's or had an Alzheimer's diagnosis. You don't know if it's Alzheimer's, but it's a dementia-causing illness. It's actually an optimistic thing to read. So people are talking about the threats to their identity. Who am I anymore? Who am I going to be? And if I can't do this, and if people won't listen to me anymore because I'm off the list, and so you get, and it can even be helpful to see quotes of other people having your negative feelings. Then you realize I'm not alone, right? Other people have been through this. Then there are beautiful ways of expressing it, and that the ordinary person wouldn't be able to think of. So you look at these lists of metaphoric ways. One person, I think it was Bryden, said, it's like I'm walking down the hall, and it's like she could use this, and we probably can understand. The new generations won't. It's like carrying a deck of index cards, all carefully ordered. You know how we used to prepare them to give a talk, and dropping them on the floor. That's what my mind is like. And once it's all over the floor, what do I do? But she has a very beautiful metaphor for what it feels like. And somebody else saying it's like looking through lace curtains. I've got a fix on the world, and then a breeze comes, and I've lost it. So looking at beautiful descriptions of negative things can be helpful. And then we've got a collection of what they have to say. Here's a message for those of you being diagnosed now. These are and basically they're uplifting. You can manage this. I managed it. You can manage. We're going to get through this. And then messages for families and caregivers about what it's like to, what your family member might be experiencing. And that can be very helpful because you can point it. You don't have to come up with the words yourself. You can point at this quote and say, could you please read that every morning before breakfast? So the resources of other people, so having a library of these kinds of memoirs, I think it's more uplifting than reading the how-to books written by the outsiders. I mean, you need those too, right? But from the insiders, it's a different point of view. There are groups, there are cancer groups and dementia, and that's one of the things that some of these authors argued for. The Alzheimer's Society has to serve the person with cognitive impairment as well as their families. And now there's earlier and earlier diagnosis and some symptom relief that allows people to do a little bit more early on. And people need to I think, have the opportunity to write and read what other people have written. So it might start with reading what other people have written and then write about. So a writing prompt in my writing groups might be, a good day is. And who knows what that might lead to, right? And also sharing what you're writing, which I didn't emphasize here, the benefits for all of us of, we always say, well, the rest of you all write better than I do, or, my pen's not really working today, or we give all these messages, but when we have the courage to read what we just wrote, we're often very impressed with at least a little piece of what we wrote. And very often, if we write for 10 or 15 minutes, it's what we say at the end that becomes meaningful. You kind of have to get the pen going. And other times, it's somebody will say, well, that was a surprising expression. It really hit me in the heart. And then you look at what this banal thing you just wrote with a different light if somebody saw something interesting in it. So I think writing and journaling can be one of the tools of dealing with life's difficulties, and it could be part of any program when there's diagnosis. I can imagine the ALS program, right? When somebody goes in and gets a diagnosis of ALS, I could imagine, there's going to be depression and that kind of thing, but there'd be an opportunity to do writing writing in a group, maybe with other sufferers or maybe not, but some opportunity to just write everything you're thinking to get you past the depression stage and more into a coping stage. Thank you.
This gentleman here, we've got what time for one more, then what can you all hear me? Yeah. And I'm ready to come out. So I'd like to ask you for an opinion. I'm going to define writing as at least the 20th century, and I'm going to talk about voice recognition software, 21st century. Everyone in my household now has a gift from me, voice recognition software. I saw someone advertise today on the internet for $35 a product which just blows you away. It will learn in about 5 minutes of your talking, your accent, and your language. So what role would you see for people who are non-aphasic and can talk to use voice recognition software, probably alone, because it works basically one-on-one, for creating their narratives and their poetry? Most of your discussion has been about writing. I think in the modern era, writing has got all its values, but it's now being displaced by what I just described.
I think voice recognition could be very helpful for the first draft. But I think there's still going to be a lot of potential with the editing phase. If you want to put something, create a poem, or I guess there's an occasional poet who can do it off the top of their head, but I would just assume that most of us have to go through a number of drafts. But I haven't seen good voice recognition. I spent in my double vision era, boy, I spent hours and hours with Dragon Naturally Dictate, correcting and correcting and correcting. But now the magic is here for $35.
Dragon is very, very powerful now, yes.
Yeah. So I think that will be great for first drafts, and then it helps people to move on to crafting something. And makes it possible for a greater variety of people to take part.
So So what we'll do now is we've still got the room for another half an hour. Ellen will be around, and if you'd like to ask any questions, I'm sure she'd be able to answer them. We've got some food and coffee still at the back. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much, Ellen.